Prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future, and even more so if it's about the future of JavaScript, as app developers will be spending the rest of our lives in the future of JavaScript. So in today's video, we'll look at new features coming to the language, the current state of front-end frameworks and new features they're releasing, as well as disruptive trends that could change everything in 2020. And if you're here because you hate JavaScript, make sure to stay tuned until the end, because we'll look at a few tools that you can use to build web apps without JavaScript. The future of JavaScript isn't what it used to be. Make sure to like and subscribe, and let me know what you think about JavaScript in the comments below. One lucky comment will win this one-of-a-kind t-shirt. Let's start things off by taking a look at some of the newest features coming to a JavaScript near you in 2020. And if you don't already know how new features make their way into the language, make sure to check out my History of JavaScript video. It explains the purpose of Technical Committee 39 and how proposals make their way into the language as actual features. You can see all the proposals on GitHub. There are currently 8 finished proposals slated to be published in 2020, but many of them have already been shipped to the browser, Node.js, and Typescript, so you can start using them today. Let's take a look at a few of the big ones and see why they're awesome and when you would want to use them. Dynamic imports, a function that allows you to lazily import a module at runtime. In other words, your imports no longer have to be static at the top of the file. You can load modules asynchronously from anywhere in your code. This means you can delay the loading of non-essential dependencies in your application to improve performance. Notice in this code snippet how we're awaiting the loading of a module as a promise when the user clicks a button. Next, we have optional chaining, which is the most popular new feature according to my extremely limited Twitter poll. We call it the Elvis Operator for obvious reasons. If you've ever used Angular, it should look very familiar to you. It makes it possible to call a deeply nested object property without throwing an error if its parent property is undefined. If you've ever used the lodash get function, this is a good replacement for it. It's extremely useful if you're working with an API or database that returns a bunch of deeply nested objects, and you don't want your app to break at runtime if intermediate properties on those objects are undefined. Next, we have a similar looking new feature called the NoLeash coalescing operator. In many cases, you might want to set a default value for a property when it's undefined. You can already do that in JavaScript using a logical OR operator, but it can be problematic if the defined value is a 0 or an empty string, because JavaScript will coerce those values to falsy. It's super annoying because then you have to do runtime type checking in your code. In 2020, no more. The double question mark is falsy only if it's null or undefined, so the end result is more predictable code when setting default values. JavaScript is also getting a new primitive data type, Bigint. It can represent numbers beyond JavaScript's max safe integer value, which is limited to 64 bits. You can create a Bigint by adding an n to a regular integer. Or you can use the Bigint constructor to make numbers that are completely massive. But to be honest, it probably won't be needed by most developers, unless you're doing extremely precise timestamps or geometric calculations. But it is a JavaScript primitive, so you should definitely know about it. So that gives you a preview of things coming to JavaScript, but make sure to check out all of the finished proposals on GitHub. Let's switch gears to one of the biggest disruptions in the JavaScript world, Typescript. It first appeared on the 2016 Stack Overflow survey, being used by less than half of 1% of developers. Fast forward 3 years, it's now a top 10 language used by more than 20% of developers. It's one of those rare technologies in the JS world that seems to be well loved by both front-end and back-end developers and across frameworks. Now, you might have watched my prediction video last year. My first prediction was that 2019 would be the year of web components. At this point, I'd have to say that mostly has not been the case. They did see more adoption in 2019, but not in any big spectacular way. More importantly, they saw a lot of criticism and a lot of pushback. But there are some really good tools out there dedicated to building web components, like Stencil and LitElement, which is another Google-sponsored project that has been gaining a lot of steam lately. Now let's talk about some front-end frameworks, starting with the big underdog of 2019, Svelte. It's been around for a few years, but in April 2019, version 3 was released. It generated a ton of excitement because it's put together into a very elegant, easy-to-learn package, and it's highly performant with no runtime dependencies. Its NPM downloads have roughly tripled over the last year, and it's a great place to take refuge from the status quo. Speaking of which, let's take a look at React, Angular, and Vue. In terms of adoption, React is by far the dominant force with more than twice as many downloads as Angular and Vue combined. But downloads are just one piece of data in a bigger picture. Let's also take a look at jobs on Stack Overflow. We've got 850 openings for React, 388 for Angular, and 156 for Vue. So we have a similar distribution with React as the clear leader. Last year, the big new feature in React was hooks. Today, we have another big experimental feature in React, concurrent mode. It allows the framework to handle multiple state updates at the same time. and it opens the door for a new built-in React component called Suspense. Suspense will wait for asynchronous activity to finish in its children, such as an API call to a cloud database, or better yet, using the new dynamic imports feature to lazy load a React component at runtime. That means you can handle loading states declaratively, and you don't need to manually toggle some kind of Boolean value in your code. Now moving on to the Angular world, the big new update is Ivy. It's enabled by default in Angular 9, and it's an entirely new compiler for Angular. But what's more exciting to me is that someone finally decided to build a static site generator for Angular. By coincidence, they're expected to release an alpha version of it today, so we can see how it compares to Gatsby, ViewPress, and so on. Moving on to the Vue world, a big new feature is the Composition API. It's a set of tools aimed at providing better code reusability in complex Vue applications. It does that by taking some of Vue's core capabilities like reactive state and exposing them as functions. These smaller pieces can then be used to compose more complex components, and they're much easier to strongly type with Typescript. So frameworks are cool and all, but the web platform itself has some new features that fundamentally extend the types of applications that you can build on the web. A huge one is the Web Authentication API, or WebAuthn. It gives the browser access to authenticate via hardware-based authenticators, and that means your web app can do things like biometric auth. And another one to keep an eye on is the Native File System API, which can give your web application access to the user's local files, something that web developers have wanted since the beginning of time. It's currently available in Chrome with a flag, but other than that, it's not supported. Another small but awesome feature is the new loading attribute for images and iframes. There's a million different lazy loading JavaScript libraries out there, but now it's built into the browser natively with a simple HTML attribute. Now, speaking of browsers, there's a disruptive new browser out there called Brave. I started using it a few weeks ago, and now I use it for almost 90% of my browsing both on mobile and desktop. The CEO of the company is none other than Brendan Eich, the creator of JavaScript. The browser feels almost just like Chrome, and you can install all the Chrome extensions that you know and love, but it feels faster because it's blocking ads and trackers by default. JavaScript, of course, is not just for the browser. We also have Node.js. The most exciting new feature in Node has to be worker threads. One of the biggest limitations of JavaScript that people like to point out is that it's single-threaded. That means you can't have two single processes running at the same time. In 2020, that's no longer an issue because we now have the worker threads module, and it opens the door to use threads to execute JavaScript in parallel. Another awesome feature that shipped in Node is support for ES modules. In Node 13, you can use import and export statements instead of require. One of the fastest growing backend tools for Node is Nest.js. It takes advantage of TypeScript to build server-side applications that scale and that are very developer-friendly. Nest.js can also help you integrate another disruptive technology, GraphQL. This is a trend that has been ongoing for a couple years now, but GraphQL is just continuing to grow and grow. When it comes to deploying your backend, you have a lot of different options, which you can see in my Cloud Computing 2020 video. But as it turns out, many web applications in today's world don't need to build their own backend at all. It can be far more productive to use something like AWS Amplify or Firebase, both of which are continuing to grow as well. These tools provide everything you need to grow and scale a mobile application, allowing your team to focus almost entirely on building an awesome front-end user experience. But JavaScript isn't just for browsers and servers, it's also for mobile applications. The big one, of course, is React Native, and we also have Ionic and NativeScript. They've all remained pretty much flat over the last year in terms of NPM downloads. React Native has added some nice new improvements like fast refresh, and Ionic now supports React where they previously only supported Angular. But all in all, not too much exciting to speak of in this space. And that gives us a perfect segue into the JavaScript anti-heroes, the emerging technologies where you might place your bets other than JavaScript. In June of 2019, Apple released Swift UI. It provides a way to build declarative UIs similar to how you would with React, but with the Swift programming language. So it promises to greatly improve the iOS developer experience, but again, it's only for iOS. When it comes to building cross-platform apps for iOS and Android, a big disruptive force is Flutter. It uses the Dart programming language, which is very similar syntactically to JavaScript. And in 2019, Dart was the fastest growing programming language, and Flutter one of the hottest open source projects on GitHub. And it also now supports the web as a target in beta. But in the long term, an even bigger disruption to the JavaScript ecosystem is WebAssembly. Just a few days ago, WebAssembly became an official fourth language on the web alongside JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. Now, I don't want to come off as if WebAssembly is going to replace JavaScript. In fact, that's not the case at all. It's a complement to JavaScript, allowing us to build an even greater variety of applications. And more importantly, better quality applications as good as any desktop app. My favorite case study is Figma. If we look closely at their product, we'll see they have a shell built with React. Inside that shell, we have a high-performance design tool powered by WebAssembly. In fact, I used Figma to design the cover for this video. Currently, languages like C, C++, and Rust can compile to WASM, and it's starting to emerge on even more languages like C#. Microsoft recently released a new framework called Blazor, and partially through the magic of WebAssembly, it allows you to build web applications using C#, HTML, and CSS. And in the future, I'd expect to see even more languages that can elegantly interop with JavaScript. We've covered a lot in the last 10 minutes, but that's just a small sample of everything that's going on in the massive JavaScript world. We have tools like Cypress that are changing the way we test our applications, tools like Gatsby that change the way we build our JavaScript apps, and we have tools like Xstate giving us new ways to think about state management. I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up there. Thanks for watching, and remember to always bet on JavaScript.